In this video, I'm going to walk you through what a carbon footprint is and how we measure it and how we understand some of the activities that your organisation will be undertaking that are contributing towards your carbon footprint. In non-technical language, there are 5 key areas that your organisation has that will be an easy way to engage your team on understanding this footprint process. Energy and buildings, so the things like electricity that you're buying or maybe any gas boilers you've got on site, those will be sources of carbon emissions that are making up that carbon footprint. Travel and transport is another one where people driving to work, business travel, things you might be getting delivered in is also going to be a significant part of your footprint. Water usage might be quite a small part of this. However, it is also important to understand your exposure to water because it might be that you're overexposed in terms of flooding, or some areas are increasingly under risk from drought. And while it's a small part of your carbon footprint, it's important to understand how it contributes. We've got the things that you buy and the things that you sell, or your supply chain, and this is where most of your footprint impact is going to lie, in that anything that you're buying or selling does have a carbon footprint associated with it, and therefore makes up quite a big part of your organisation. And finally, we've got waste as well, where it's the things that you're throwing away that maybe you're thinking of or you're already engaging on with things like recycling. Those greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and F gases. Now, the reason why we've got those 4 F gases or fluorinated gases, even though they're only 2% of the total footprint of how much greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, is because they actually contribute quite a large amount, and not all gases are equal. This is where we have the figure greenhouse warming potential, where carbon dioxide may have a global warming potential of 1, but something like methane is nearly 30 times as bad as carbon dioxide in terms of its warming effects, and therefore can be a much bigger part of your footprint. The reason why I'm explaining this as well is not to get too caught up in the detail here, but if you are doing agricultural processes, then you might be producing a lot more methane, and therefore this might be a much more significant part of your carbon footprint that you want to address in order to achieve those reductions. We can see here that F gases, as mentioned, are thousands of times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of their potency and their contributions towards global warming and greenhouse warming effects. And therefore you might want to again identify those. And typically they operate in things like leaky air conditioning systems. Don't worry too much about understanding all of these greenhouse gases, because there is a single figure that combines all of these, which is carbon dioxide equivalent. And that E, the equivalent part, is really important to understand, and it's something that you should be always looking for if you are assessing other suppliers or customers and what footprints they are giving you. That E is what means they are taking into account all of their different contributions towards climate change and their carbon footprint. CO2e expresses the climate impact of all greenhouse gases together as if they were emitted as carbon dioxide, and is therefore a comparable metric for you to use going forward without needing to remember all of the information on the different greenhouse gases. If we take something like a small petrol car, that will have around 276 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per mile that it contributes. Those emissions are going to be coming from the tailpipe, but they're also coming from the extraction process of the petrol, and therefore these government figures take into account a lot more than perhaps the manufacturer's emissions do, where sometimes they only include things like the tailpipe emissions. It's important to again understand and look for that E when you are quoting any of these figures, because that means it's taking into account much more the impact here. A large petrol car will have a larger footprint than this as well, so it's important to understand and be accurate if you are data gathering what vehicles you are driving, but also the size of them and as well as the fuel source. That combination of information is really important to get more accurate data. So if we look at your carbon footprint, those 5 key areas are really the easy way to start understanding what your contributions are. So things like supply chain, buildings and energy, transport, waste and water are ways that you can look at your business in a very simple way to understand where the emissions are coming from. Those emissions may be direct, that you are in control of. They may also be indirect, and it may be ones that are coming from outside of your direct control, such as your supply chain, where actually it's the decisions you make on what you buy and where you buy it from that is going to have an impact on those emissions. You might not be able to directly control whether they are high or low carbon. And that idea of control and influence is really key to remember on this journey, because understanding those different kind of powers and where your influence lies is how you're going to be able to accelerate and take action here. When it comes to the actual technical part of measuring your carbon footprint and reporting on this, there are three different areas that the footprint gets split into. Scope 1 is essentially your gas heating and vehicles. And these different scopes are how we then quantify and define your footprint. So Scope 1 is gas heating and typically any vehicles that you own. Scope 2 is very simple. It's typically your electricity, or if you are on a district heating network, it might be some purchased electricity or heating from that. Scope 3 is everything else. There are 15 different subcategories of Scope 3, which I won't go into here, but it's essentially things that you buy, that you sell, that you throw away, and bits of travel also do come into Scope 3 as well. So it's a really big part of your footprint and a really big part of your kind of operational kind of breakdown, and therefore your carbon footprint will look something like this, where Scope 3 is maybe 70, 80, even 90% of your actual total footprint, whereas Scopes 1 and 2 might be quite limited. If you are working in a co-working space, so for example, my company at Small 99, we've got a serviced office, so we don't actually have any vehicles, we don't have any gas heating, and we don't even buy our own electricity. It's all done through an organisation, and in our case, we don't actually have any Scope 1 or 2 emissions. Everything is in Scope 3. And this is why the transparency of language on what you're reporting on is so important, to understand where those gaps may lie. It's also why I recommend, if you are starting out on this journey, that you don't focus too much on the scope language and instead focus on those 5 key categories, which might be a lot easier for you to understand and to get going with. We can see here those different scopes and the contributions towards it, and we can see that we've got all these different greenhouse gases in the sky at the top, and then we've got the different 3 scopes that are contributing to it, and all of those 15 different Scope 3 categories. And that's where it gets quite confusing and can be quite overwhelming. In terms of your footprint, don't be too panicked at this stage. You're not going to be measuring everything at once, and it might be that in the first year, you look back to last year and you try and identify just your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and you try and gather data for that from your energy bills to start off with. It might be then this year, and at the end of this year, you start to look at 2024 and looking back at the year's total emissions, that you then add on other elements of this, like business travel and maybe your waste as well. And then next year, or in the future, you might start adding more and more data in, where you then add on commuting emissions or things like distribution as well. And you start to build this picture up over time with blocks, these kind of building blocks of your footprint over time. It's very unlikely you're going to measure everything at once, unless you are working with an external consultant who might be coming in and helping you on this process. However, even then, it's quite likely that you're going to have limitations in what data you have available within your organisation, as you might not be able to measure all three scopes at once. That's okay. The key really is being transparent and being very clear on what you are measuring and what data sets you are using, because even if it might be that you use the wrong data set and maybe it's from 2019 in terms of the data that you're using, that actually that's probably okay. You might just want to make sure that you will then update it, and you can update any historical errors there as well, and that data transparency is really key. So Scope 1, as mentioned, is essentially things that you're burning, and it's going to be like your gas, it's going to be any fuel on site. Scope 2 is electricity you're buying, and if you are using something like renewable energy and purchasing it from verified sources, it might be you can claim 0 on your Scope 2 emissions because of that. However, that is something to be verified independently. And then Scope 3, as mentioned, is really everything else. It's the products you're buying, it's how they arrive at your door, it's who you're working with, it's where is that going. It's a much bigger question around the fundamental operations of your organisation. In the next section, I'm going to walk through in a bit more detail what that example carbon footprint is going to look like, and just give you some examples and build up a picture of that.